So the topic is, does suffering provide a good reason for atheism? A part of thinking through that topic is thinking about suffering, and it's not pleasant to dwell on suffering, but that's a part of it. At least some of that's got to happen in thinking through this topic. So I'm not intending to fill our minds with horrors for no reason, but there's some horrors that are going to come before our minds, so maybe brace yourself for that a little bit. As I say, I'm going to jump right into it. And I'll start by talking about why, so the subtitle is A Skeptical Theist's Analysis, so I consider myself a skeptical theist. But before saying what that is or anything like that, I'm just going to start off by talking about suffering and the way it's thought of as a reason for atheism. Sometimes people talk about the problem of evil, and that's, I think, an easier way to talk about that when I teach an Intro to Philosophy of Religion class, and when I do, I kind of say it's kind of like the problem of bad stuff, okay? Because the evil we're talking about isn't always just evil behavior, it's just bad stuff, So among the bad stuff, there's evil behavior, but there's also like terrible suffering is a bad thing. And why does God let all these bad things happen, including that? And suffering is actually one of the main things that people focus on. So on the handout, it says here, initial skirmishes, A-T-A-T-A. That's atheist, theist, back and forth. Okay, so I'm going to just start off with that, and so I'll mention the first thing on the handout, and then I'll sort of expand upon that a little bit. And so first, if I, morally imperfect human, if I wouldn't permit, and the same thing would be true of you, if you wouldn't permit horrific suffering that you could easily prevent, then neither would a morally perfect being permit suffering that could easily be prevented, so there is no God. So let's think about that a little bit. Dostoevsky, author of 19th century Russian author, Brothers Karamazov is one of the books that he wrote. I would say, maybe somebody can confirm this, but my belief is that he's a Christian, at least sympathetic to Christianity. Anyways, he has these characters, brothers Ivan and Alyosha. And I'm just going to read you a quotation where Ivan, so Alyosha's training to, be a religious, like a priest or something like that, and his brother Ivan's telling him about some of the horrors in the world that make him, wonder about this Christian God. So here's Ivan talking to his brother Alyosha about some of these horrors. By the way, a Bulgarian I met lately in Moscow, Ivan went on, told me about the crimes committed by Turks and Circassians in all part of Bulgaria through fear of a general rising of the Slavs. They burn villages, they murder, outrage women and children, they nail their prisoners by the ears to the fences, leave them so till morning, and in the morning they hang them. All sorts of things you can't imagine. These Turks took a pleasure in torturing children, too, cutting the unborn child from the mother's womb, and tossing babies up in the air and catching them on the points of their bayonets before their mother's eyes. Doing it before the mother's eyes was what gave zest to the amusement. Here's another scene that I thought very interesting. Imagine a trembling mother with her baby in her arms, a circle of invading Turks around her. They planned a diversion. They pet the baby, laugh to make it laugh. They succeed. The baby laughs. At that moment, a Turk points a pistol 4 inches from the baby's face. The baby laughs with glee, holds out its little hands to the pistol, and he pulls the trigger in the baby's face and blows out its brains. Artistic, wasn't it? So that's among, there's much more horrific things than that, but that's a pretty horrific story. And this is fiction. Maybe Dostoevsky was drawing upon things that he knew about, but we know that terrible things of this sort, and maybe in your mind worse things like this happen. We read about them. Stories about, in the war in Syria now, wars in Sudan in the past. On the streets of the United States, we have women or children abducted and mutilated and raped. We have lots of things happening to huge populations. So the Holocaust, millions treated in absolutely horrific ways. And just the grinding poverty and natural disasters in the world today. All these things, maybe these natural disasters, there's no particular person to blame other than perhaps God, since humans often aren't responsible for these, tsunamis, etc. And when you read about these things, and especially when you get down close up on a particular person's case, they're very hard to handle. Even when it's a stranger, somebody you don't know, it's hard to handle. But, what if it's a dear loved one that this has happened to? Then you're tormented for the rest of your life, perhaps, at the thought of that. Or if it's you that this has happened to, it's worse. And that this kind of horrific suffering has happened to hundreds and thousands and millions of people. Now, and so the question that comes to the atheist's mind here, the question that's being used in pushing this point is, suppose there was somebody that you knew was, a child molester, somebody who had abducted and, raped and killed children, and you saw this person about to abduct a child in, say, some kind of public setting, and it was very easy for you to stop this person. For some reason or other, it would be easy for you. Maybe you could easily tell somebody who could stop them, or maybe you could yourself stop this person. Would you stop the person? Of course you would. Of course you would stop that person. And in fact, if we knew about you that you saw this was about to happen and you could have stopped it, but you didn't, we'd think pretty poorly of you. We'd think of you as a kind of cooperator with this person who's committing this terrible crime. Well, that's what God is like, right? It's very easy for God. First of all, He sees all these things happen. He sees that they're about to happen just before they do, and it would be easy for God to stop. So the atheist says, if God doesn't stop it, but He easily could, then that would make God a morally wicked person. But of course, the whole idea of God is it's a morally perfect person. What does this show us? There is no such person as God. If there were, there wouldn't be these terrible things that happen. Okay, and now, before we carry on here, and before we respond to this sort of argument, it's important, I think, to keep in mind that this whole discussion can seem callous. Okay? So lots of times, if you in your own life or if people that you know have experienced terrible suffering, it's not always the right time to get into a philosophical conversation with a person of that sort, right? People very often are just, they might want to talk about their horror and even they might want to talk about the suffering that they or some loved one has undergone. They may even express kind of hatred or anger at God, or at the idea that there couldn't be a God watching. Well, those people, if they're in the throes of grief, aren't always, in the mood for a philosophical conversation. So there has to be, there's a time and a place for everything, and including philosophical conversations. But there are also people who, quite seriously say, look, here's an argument for the conclusion that there is no God. And in giving this argument, they're quite seriously presenting, they too have been horrified and are horrified by these things, but they're passionately putting this forward as a reasonable case for atheism. Well, one way to show respect for a person like that who's trying to make a reasonable case for atheism is to take them seriously and have a philosophical conversation with them about this. So sometimes it is appropriate to engage people in this way that I'm going to be talking with you about today. Other times it's not appropriate, and you have to, of course, be sensible in making that decision. Okay, so that's the first move, and we'll probably go more quickly through many of the rest of these things. But the theist's reply is this. Just because a terrible thing has been permitted, we needn't automatically conclude that the person isn't loving. So, take, for example, a mother with a child who's got cancer. And cancer treatment is often unpleasant. In fact, the child might that very morning have been begging her mother not to take her to the cancer treatment that she had to be taken to. If the mother said, you don't really want to go, honey? Okay, that's okay. I don't want to make you do that. We think, well, what kind of mother are you, skipping the cancer treatment today for this kid because the kid doesn't want to go through it. A loving parent sometimes allows miseries, even of their children who they really love. Why? Well, because they don't, they wouldn't take their child to cancer treatment just for the fun of it. Of course not. They don't want their child to go through that. But they've got a reason for allowing their child to go through that treatment and have that suffering that's compatible with their love. And the reason is that it's the way to get something really good that they want to have for their child, namely being cured from the cancer. Okay, so you can't just conclude from God lets terrible things happen that God doesn't care. What you have to conclude is, well, unless God's got a good reason for letting that thing happen. Okay, now the atheist reply is, yeah, but God, the third point here, if God exists, He'd be perfect. So he wouldn't have to permit bad things to get what he wants, including cancer treatment. I mean, God doesn't need to send kids through cancer treatment in order for them to be healed. He can just heal them. He's all-powerful and all-knowing. So, the mother isn't. She's not all-powerful. She's not all-knowing. She can't take care of this. That's her only option that she knows of. The best option she knows of, and that what she has to take, is the cancer treatment, even though it's misery in certain ways for the child. But she does it because that's her only option. But that's not how it is with God. God can do it in many ways. And so, truth, the atheist might say, true, if God had a good reason to permit it because God couldn't get the good he wants without permitting it, that would make sense. But that's not how God is. He's not like us. God can do what he wants. He's all-powerful, unlike us. Okay, next move by the theist is, even a perfect being would be limited by logically necessary truths. So it's not up to God whether 2 and 2 is 4. Or put it this way, God can't make it so that 2 and 2 isn't 4. There are, even if God's not constrained in the sense of, being forced, it's still the case that there are things that God can't do. God can't make it the case that 2 and 2 is 5. And there are other necessary truths besides mathematical truths. So here's one, or at least many people think that this is a truth. I'm one of the people who thinks this is a necessary truth. That God can't force me to freely do something. If he forces me, then I'm not freely doing it. Okay? So not even an all-powerful being. Of course, God could force me to do a thing. What he can't do is force me to do it and make me do it freely at the same time. Now, there are Calvinists among us who think otherwise, but I'm not one of them. And so God can't force us to freely do things. Some people think this is a necessary truth, and I'm one of those people. At any rate, the main point here is that that's just an example. Okay? There's an example where there's 2 good things that God wants. God wants us to be free, and he wants us to freely choose him. He wants us to freely choose what is good. But he can't guarantee that we're going to do good and do it freely. So he's got to choose. He's got to either make us free and thereby permit wrongdoing, or force us to do good, guarantee the good, but then we're not free. And that's just one example where even a perfect being, even an all-powerful being, would have a certain kind of constraint where, so in the case of the mother, if she wants to have, freedom from cancer, she has to go through this medical process. In the case of God, if God wants, how could a being who's perfect be limited? Well, he could be limited because of these necessary truths. Now, what are some other examples? I don't have a lot of other examples. But just one example is enough to get the idea that even omnipotence can be limited by necessary truths. Okay, then, last move by the atheist. Still, as many people who are theists admit, for many of the evils that we know of, we can't think of a plausible God-justifying reason. What's a God-justifying reason? It's a reason, obviously, it's a reason that God would have for permitting something such that even a perfect being would, So I guess it's typically thought of like this. God permits a bad thing if that's the only way God can avoid a worse thing. Like in the case of the mother, she's trying to avoid a worse thing. That's why she lets her child have the cancer treatment. Or if it's the only way that he can get some outweighing good things. Suppose God really wants somebody to have what's called the beatific vision, where we get to know God face to face and enjoy him forever in eternity. What if the only way to let that happen for a certain person is to allow a certain kind of misery? Well, that good is so good that it outweighs the badness of the bad thing permitted, and so either to get some outweighing good or to avoid some worse evil, God might permit some of the suffering that's around us. But what the atheist says here is, but think about some of the horrific things we know. What could God's reason be? Now, some people think, there's this reason or that reason, and they suggest a lot of reasons. But that is, some theists will suggest a lot of reasons. But a lot of theists, and I'm among them, think, it's hard to know what God's reason is for letting these terrible things happen. Somebody gives you a suggestion for a reason, you think, so for example, here are a few reasons that sometimes people mention. Punishment. Or we couldn't appreciate the good if we didn't know the evil. Or he wants us to be free. So think about these in the case of a man who abducts and rapes and kills a small child. Does punishment seem to be what's going on here? Does that child deserve that punishment? That doesn't seem very plausible, okay? How about we couldn't appreciate goodness if we didn't have that terrible event that we've learned about. That doesn't seem plausible either. I mean, actually, what Dostoevsky says in that same book is, well, sorry, I shouldn't say Dostoevsky, but Ivan, the guy who was talking there, he says, that's not worth it. You know, if that's what it takes to know the difference between good and evil, it's not worth it for us to know it. Okay, that's too high a price to pay. So that's one thing you might think. But you know, another thing you might think is this: was God's knowledge limited before God created the world? Presumably not. So God knew the difference between good and evil. Well, if that means that good and evil are knowable, you know, apart from their being evil. Well, if good and evil are knowable apart from their being evil, then why couldn't God somehow miraculously give us enough of a knowledge of His goodness, just like He had knowledge of His goodness before there was any evil? If God had that, why couldn't God miraculously give it to us? So it doesn't seem like we need it for punishment. It doesn't seem like it's a just punishment. It doesn't seem like it's needed to appreciate goodness. You have to have evil because God could appreciate goodness before there was any evil. And then as for the freedom, yeah, maybe it is really important that people are free, but that rapist could be free and yet not be permitted to do that, right? God could sneakily behind the scenes allow a lot of bad things to happen, but He could just draw a line. In fact, you know, maybe you think God has drawn a line. And sort of sometimes God intervenes and keeps people from doing things that they would otherwise do. But then you think, yeah, but if there is a God who can and does sometimes draw lines, He should have drawn a line there. And at any rate, the main point here is just this: God could have free creatures even if He sometimes drew a line. And so it's not like you couldn't have this rapist be free without letting that rape occur. Of course God could have a rapist who is free without having that rape occur. He can even let that rapist choose to follow Him or disobey Him, just not in every single way. Okay, so it seems like that's a case where we don't really know what the good reason is for God permitting it. So that's kind of how the initial skirmishes go. And I'm guessing I'm not going to get through the whole handout, but that's okay. Okay, so let's look at this argument here, section B. So, pointless suffering. The argument from pointless suffering. So, suffering is pointless just in case there is no God-justifying reason for it. Okay? It's truly pointless if there is no reason that God has that would justify God in permitting it. The mother has a justifying reason for permitting her child to have cancer, right? Suppose she said, actually, my child doesn't have cancer. I just thought it would be fun to give her cancer treatment. Well, you know, that's not a good reason for permitting your child to have cancer treatment. But if her child had cancer and she wanted to save her child's life, that is a justifying reason. And to say that an evil is pointless is to say that God has no good reason for permitting it. So here's how the argument goes. And it's put in, this is, I think, pretty close to an argument that Professor Bill Rowe recently passed away. He was known as a friendly atheist, taught at Purdue for many years. Friendly atheist because although he was an atheist, he coined the term, but in person he was also a very, very friendly to Christians. He liked us for some reason. He used to be one, maybe that's why. But he's a great guy. Anyways, this is an argument of his, and it's put in terms of evil, you know, throughout. I could have changed that so it focused on suffering instead of evil, but we'll just leave it like that. So here's how the argument goes. 5 steps. For some evils that we know of, some instance of horrific suffering, we aren't able to identify any plausible sounding God-justifying reason to permit them. I agree with that premise. I think a lot of people who are Christians or theists agree with that present premise. That is, if you're asked, why did God let that happen? You might say, I don't know. I can't think of a good reason for God to let that happen. Okay, that's a pretty common thing for theists and for Christians to admit. Some Christians think, oh no, I can tell you why, and they might offer proposals. But others think that those proposals aren't very plausible. So that first premise is one that many theists would accept. Second premise, if we aren't able to identify a God-justifying reason for these evils, there probably isn't a God-justifying reason for permitting these evils. So that would mean to say there probably are pointless evils. Then we have a sub-conclusion. Number 3, therefore, probably there is pointless evil. Next, the existence of God is logically incompatible with the existence of pointless evil. Therefore, probably there is no God. So this argument seems to be a good argument in many ways. It's a cautious argument. It says probably there is no God. So it's less bold than somebody confidently claiming to have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that atheism is true. They're just saying, look, probably it's true given this evidence. Now, you might think that's a weak argument, but, a lot of arguments in science are like that. We base our practical reasoning. We behave, we act on probabilistic sorts of conclusions. So it's powerful enough to act on. It's powerful enough to accept scientific theories, at least provisionally, on the basis of. So probably, it's cautious, but it's still got some punch to it. It's also good reasoning. So in the sense that step 3 follows from 1 and 2. And step 5 follows from 3 and 4. So it's a valid argument. The sub-conclusion follows from what precedes it, and the final conclusion follows from what precedes it. And then it's got some very strong premises. So that first premise, that there are some terrible things where we just can't think of what the reason God would have for permitting them is, that's a very plausible premise. Some people might want to resist it. I'm inclined to think it's very plausible. And then the fourth one, the existence of God is logically incompatible with the existence of pointless evil. That too is a very plausible premise. So imagine if we die, we go to heaven, God is willing to answer our questions, has a little question session, and we ask this question. We mentioned some terrible, terrible thing that happened that we heard about, maybe in our own lives, maybe the Holocaust, something we read about in the paper. We say, why did you let that happen? And suppose God's willing to answer, and God says, no reason. I just let it happen. I didn't have any reason for it at all. That strikes us as not the kind of thing that a perfect being would say. Maybe the perfect being would say, I'm not going to tell you, but the perfect being wouldn't say, I didn't have it, I just did it, on a whim. There's no reason at all for permitting it. That seems incompatible with perfect goodness, right? And so that's a reason for thinking that this premise is true. The existence of God, this perfect being, is logically incompatible with the existence of evil that has no point. There is no reason at all God had for permitting it. That's a pretty plausible premise. Now, if you're interested, I can point you to some people who question that premise. But let's grant it for now, both 1 and 4. Okay, what about the second premise? I'm sure a number of you, maybe all of you, have already seen that there's a kind of weakness in that second premise. And the weakness of that second premise is what the skeptical theist capitalizes on. The signature move of skeptical theism is to attack that particular premise. So how does that premise go? Well, look at point A under section 2 here. It talks about no-seum inferences. Some of you might know Steve Wykestra, teaches at Calvin College. I think he coined this term, no-seum inference. There are these little bugs that are no-seums. You've never heard of those before. They bite you, but you can't see them. They're flying around when you're out camping or something like that. Or even if you're just out in the backyard. So no-seams are tiny little bugs. And here's the way a no-seam inference goes. If you don't see them, they probably ain't there. Sometimes that's a good inference, right? So, I won't make any claims about. I'll just talk about what's going on in this room from here forward. And I don't see any adult elephants in this room, so probably there aren't any. I feel pretty safe in making that inference. Okay, that's a good no-seem inference. Or imagine I'm standing on the street, talking on the cell phone to my wife, looking up this driveway. It's not a very long driveway to our garage. And suppose she says to me, is there a van in the garage? And I look, it's well lit in the garage. I'm only 30, 40 feet away. The garage is basically looking empty. I say, no, there's no van in the garage. That's a no-seem inference I'm using there, right? I'm looking up there and I'm going, I don't see any van in the garage, so there's no van in the garage. That's a good no-seem inference. But suppose she says to me, are there any insects in the garage? And I stay standing down there in the street and I say, nope, no insects. Because I don't see any, so there probably aren't any. That's a bad inference. What's the difference? Why is one good, one bad? Well, it has to do with the kind of detection abilities that I've got, right? My van detecting abilities from that distance and in that lighting are such that if there were a van there, I'd see it. That's what my detection abilities are like. So if I don't see it, it's a good inference to conclude that there probably isn't one. I can be even more confident than probably. I'd say, no, there's definitely not a van in the garage. Not so when it comes to insect detection from that distance. Right? The fact that I, from the street looking up 30 feet to the driveway, can't see an insect in the garage, that's not a good reason for concluding there probably isn't an insect in the garage. Unless I've got maybe Superman, that would be a good inference, but not for me. Right? I don't have the kinds of detection abilities which are such that if there were an insect in the garage, I would see it. And so I can't conclude from my failure to see it that there probably isn't one. Okay, so premise 2 is that it's a noseem inference. It says, we aren't able to identify a God-justifying reason. Maybe you could sort of expand that a little bit to say, if we humans who have thought about this for centuries, including many who believe in God, if we can't think of a God-justifying reason for permitting evils, then there probably isn't one. So what's going on here? Well, what's going on here is, in order for this to be a good inference, it would have to be the case that our detection abilities, when it comes to looking for God-justifying reasons, we have to have the kinds of detection abilities which are such that if there were a God-justifying reason, we'd probably see it. Well, is that true? Is that plausible? Is it plausible to think that if we were trying to think of reasons God might have, we would latch onto them if there were any? That's not very plausible, right? If human minds are what we know them to be, I mean, they're great in many respects, but they're finite. And if God's mind is, even if you're an atheist, you should think God's mind, if there were such a being, would be infinite, unlimited. Why would we be the first to know if God had reasons for permitting bad things or not? It doesn't seem like we have the kind of abilities that would be needed. Basically, the abilities that would be needed would be, so there are other examples that are some parallel cases that are made. So the insect case, just like my failure to see insects in the garage doesn't indicate that there aren't any insects, or my failure to see that the chess move, suppose I'm a novice chess player, I just barely know the rules, and I see some chess champion make a move, or maybe I see a move made on a computer screen, and I'm not sure whether this is a move made by a chess champion or a computer program that's excellent, or whether it's like some moron playing chess for the first time. Right? I can't tell the difference. But I shouldn't say I can't think of any good reason for making that chess move, so probably there isn't a good reason for making that chess move, because I don't know hardly anything at all about chess. So if that's the situation, my failure to see that there's a good reason for that chess move isn't a good reason for thinking there isn't a good reason for that chess move. Or is there life somewhere else out there in the universe? Right? Suppose we take our failure to detect life on other planets. Is that a good reason for thinking that there is no life on other planets? It seems not. I mean, we haven't come close to exhausting observations of planets and knowing what their conditions are and things like that. So in the same way, our failure to detect God-justifying reasons isn't a good reason for thinking that there aren't any God-justifying reasons. So premise 2 employs a bad noseem inference. Man, I'm just going to get you guys the view. I'm not going to have time to complain about this view. That doesn't seem fair, because this is a view I like. I should show you some problems with it. But okay, I'm going to keep going here. So, skeptical theses. Here are some skeptical theses that sort of further unpack the motivation for the view that we shouldn't think we're good at detecting God-justifying reasons. 3 theses. 1, there could be goods and evils, many more goods and evils than we've ever heard of, maybe, and it's not just ones we've heard of. I mean, we can also imagine good things, and we can imagine terrible things, right? Good things that have never happened that we wish would happen, or terrible things that have never happened that we hope never happen. So there's actual goods and evils that we've observed or heard about, and then there are imagined ones that we can think of. And it seems very plausible to think that a perfect being would have in mind, and of course these imagined goods and evils are relevant, right? You might think, that the child's death from cancer didn't happen. If the mother took her daughter to this cancer treatment and then she was cured, okay? She imagined the death from cancer, and she tried to avoid it and say she succeeded. Suppose God, what kind of terrible things does God imagine that we can't imagine? Are there unknown. Basically, are there unknown possible goods and evils, right? That child dying from cancer didn't happen, but it's a possible terrible thing. What kinds of possible terrible things are there? What kinds of possible good things are there? And so this first thesis says, we have no good reason for thinking that the possible goods and possible evils that we know of or can imagine, we have no good reason for thinking that set of, let's just think of it as a set of good and evil things that we've heard about or are able to imagine. We've got no good reason to think that that sample that we're looking at is representative of all the goods and evils that there are, right? Often you take a sample and, if you're doing a poll and you take the sample in the right way, you can make good predictions about how the election's going to go. Or whatever not always election results. But polls are good and are helpful if you have the right kind of sample. So here's the question. Suppose our sample is all the possible good and evil things that we can imagine or that we've heard of. Is that sample representative of all the goods and evils that there are when it comes to thinking about what would play into a God-justifying reason? Well, we haven't got any good reason at all to think that the sample that we can think of is representative with respect to all the goods and evils that there are. That's the first thesis. Second thesis. We can think about what kinds of interconnections there are between goods and evils, and we're thinking here about omnipotence-limiting connections. Okay, so not causal ones, like apart from a miracle there'd be no cure for this cancer because God can, that's not forced upon God. God can just do the miracle. But we're thinking about connections that are that are logically necessary, like the one between having a free creature and guaranteeing that free creature does what is right. You can't have both. And so the question is, what other connections like that are there? Well, we try hard to think of some. Maybe we can't think of a lot. And so here's the question arises. Are the connections that we can think of or imagine representative of all the connections that there are between possible goods and possible evils? And the claim here is this. We have no good reason for thinking that the omnipotence-limiting interconnections that we know of or can imagine between possible goods and the permission of possible evils are relevantly representative of the omnipotence-limiting interconnections there are between such goods and the permissions of such evils. Okay? And to be relevantly representative is to be representative when it comes to featuring in God-justifying reasons for permitting evils. And then lastly, we have no good reason for thinking that the total moral value or disvalue that we see in a certain complex state of affairs, or not in some complex states of affairs, accurately reflects the total moral value or disvalue that they really have. So think about the history of humanity. What you know of it. Think about what you know about the history of humanity. You know a fair bit about it. And just think about the bits that you know, all the bits that you know about. Is it what's the overall value of the history of humanity? That's a very hard thing to make a judgment about, right? It's a very complex state of affairs. There's a lot going on in the history of humanity. A lot of good things, a lot of bad things. Why think that we'd be particularly good at assessing what that overall value is? It's just too big for our minds. I mean, even if you focus on only the parts that we know of, right? Of course, there's the parts we don't know of, but suppose we focus just on the parts we know of. That's already so complex. It's not plausible to think that we'd be particularly good at assessing the overall value of that sort of thing. So these three theses are meant to support the conclusion that when it comes to our detection abilities with respect to God-justifying reasons, there's no good reason to think that we're really good at it. And given that, there's no good reason to think that our failure to detect God-justifying reasons is a good reason for thinking that there aren't any God-justifying reasons. So all of this is by way of support for the claim that premise 2 is involving a bad no-seum inference. Okay, point C here on the handout, under 2. Two components to skeptical theism, the skeptical component and the theistic component. Skeptical theists are theists. That means they think God exists. Of course, non-theists won't be friendly to that component of skeptical theism. They're not theists. But there's also a skeptical component. And the skeptical component isn't like, widespread skepticism. By the way, this term, skeptical theism, was coined by Paul Draper, a colleague of mine at Purdue, who's a non-theist, pushes arguments from evil. And he calls this move, made by many others before me, skeptical theism. The skeptical component says this: it's not reasonable to make a no-seum inference from our inability to detect God-justifying reasons for the evils we know of, to the conclusion that there probably are no such reasons. The skeptical part says, we can't tell whether, our inability to detect them isn't a good reason for thinking there aren't any. We aren't particularly good at detecting God-justifying reasons. So it's skepticism about our ability to think through how God would reason about whether to permit an evil. We're good at some things, we're not good at other things. That's among the things we're not particularly good at. That's the claim. And let me make 4 comments about that, clarificatory remarks. So, 1, the skeptical component is not a reason for theism, right? To say, hey, we're not particularly good at detecting what God's reasons might be if there were a God, that doesn't show that theism is true, right? All it tells us is that we're not particularly good at figuring out how God would think through things. So the skeptical theist isn't here offering any reason for God's existence. Really, what the skeptical theist is doing is questioning a certain defense of atheism. But you can question a defense of atheism and be an atheist, actually. I think that's the next point here. There's no reason that atheists and agnostics cannot endorse the skeptical component. Right? Some people, you might know, maybe you yourself are in this position. You might have heard of some arguments so maybe you believe in God, and you've heard of some arguments for God's existence that you think are not very good arguments. Right? Probably a lot of people who believe in God agree that there are some bad arguments for God's existence. Well, why can't atheists think that there are some bad arguments for atheism? Of course they can. Right? It's good for theists to be able to set aside and not rely on bad arguments for theism. Likewise, it's good for atheists to set aside and not rely on bad arguments for atheism. And so, an atheist can recognize this, can say, yeah, that skeptical component is plausible. Why should I think I'm so good at being able to detect reasons a perfect being would have? I don't want to rely on that no-seum inference. Okay, so I'm not proposing here something that's only acceptable to theists. And why? Well, because I'm not trying to prove atheism is false. I'm just pointing out that here's one bad argument for atheism. So atheists themselves could be friendly to this, and I think some atheists are friendly to this. Point 3, this is a clarificatory remark 3, the theist skepticism is intended as a common sense sort of skepticism, not as a radical kind of skepticism. Radical skepticism would say things like, how do I know that there's really a world out here? It seems like there is, but maybe I'm in the matrix, or maybe there's some deceptive person, tricking me, some powerful deceptive person tricking me. That's a kind of radical skepticism. Or maybe I came into existence 5 minutes ago with fake memories, right? That's radical skepticism. That's not being proposed here. Instead, the idea is, look, there are a lot of things we do know, and there are a lot of things we don't know. This is just common sense. I know that there are people in the room. I know that I haven't been talking for 5 hours up here, okay? You weren't in here, or at least I wasn't in here 5 hours ago. I know things like that. I know that my back hurts a little bit right now. All right, so I can by introspection tell that, and you can tell what you're thinking about right now. So we know all kinds of things. We know right and wrong, but there's also many things that we don't know. So there's lots of really complicated logical theorems or mathematical claims. None of us knows whether Goldbach's conjecture is true, but that's the mathematical claim that every even number is a sum of 2 prime numbers. There's no counterexamples yet, but think about how many they've looked at. A lot, but what fraction is that of all the numbers there are? It's a very small fraction, so we need a proof. We haven't got one. So we don't know it's true. So there's lots of things we don't know. Math, we don't know whether what's going on. I don't know what's going on in all the minds in this room, right? Maybe I can tell a little bit by looking at you, but you could be, who knows what you're thinking about? I can't tell. I don't know what's going on, life on other planets, or even non-life on other planets. There's just so much that we don't know. So it's part of common sense that I know a lot. There's a lot of things I do know, and a lot of things that I don't know. And the skeptical theist's claim is just our intention is to add to the list of things we don't know something really simple. Namely, we don't know how a perfect being would reason their way through whether to permit horrible suffering. Because a perfect being would have to consider all these goods and evils and connections between them and know the true value of all these goods and evils. And that's something that we aren't able to do. That seems very plausible. You know, some people have this view that, here's a view that I think G.E. Moore might have had, a famous philosopher, early 20th century. You might have the view that the morally right thing to do is what maximizes utility or maximizes value and its consequences. Suppose you had that view, and then you thought, but how am I supposed to know what's going to maximize, goodness in the world? I mean, how would I figure that out? Maybe I'd do something that would make the world really good for centuries and then utter disaster if I did it. I mean, I don't know. So if you had the view that the right thing to do is what maximizes happiness, and then you also thought, but how am I supposed to know, what maximizes happiness? You have to think, I don't know what the right thing to do is. And it's the same kind of view that says, I don't know what the ultimate consequences of things are. That's just beyond me. That same kind of view would say, I don't know how God would reason about these things. He's taken into consideration everything. I can't do that. So it's supposed to be a very natural, plausible kind of skepticism. And then the last point is this, underneath these four clarificatory remarks. Many arguments from evil, sometimes very obviously, as in that one we looked at, premise 2 obviously relied on a no-seem inference. Now that's very close to the argument that Professor Rowe presented. But other arguments rely on this inference, on our failure to see as evidence that there isn't anything there. Some arguments for evil, and I think a lot of them do, if you look carefully at them and ask yourself about each of the premises, why do they think that, why do they think that, you're going to eventually, I think, very often at least, come across some kind of a no-seem inference going on. And if you do see that that's what's happening, that's a reason to question that as it's a reason to help the atheist himself or herself question that premise, because they too should recognize, why I think we're so good at this. Okay, so I think my time's up, and so what I'll do is, I'll just, they didn't say I had to stop now, but I'll stop now, except for this. I'm going to sort of give you a general overview of these two objections. So I have two objections here, Objection 1 and Objection 2, Sections 3 and 4. The first objection is this. If I don't know how God's reasoning would work, well, why am I helping people who look like they're suffering? After all, maybe that's the best thing. I mean, God seems to be letting it happen. How am I supposed to know if it's a good thing to help somebody? Why would I send money to people who are poor? Why would I, help my child? Why would I do anything kind to relieve suffering for anybody around me? If I can't tell what the ultimate consequences are, I don't know what the right thing to do is. So the idea is this: if you're a skeptical theist, you should be in doubt about any of your moral beliefs. And the complaint is, that's crazy. Okay? You shouldn't be in doubt about whether to help somebody. Obviously, you should help them. So if your skeptical theism forces you to be in doubt, then that's a bad view, that skeptical theism. That's the first complaint about skeptical theism, the complaint that it leads to moral skepticism, and it's not very plausible to be a moral skeptic. Christians aren't moral skeptics. Christians think they know right from wrong. So if you're a Christian and you're a skeptical theist, you're in trouble, supposedly, because it leads to moral skepticism. That's one complaint. And then the second one, and I'll just mention them from now. We can talk about them if you like, but I'll just mention them. The second one is this. I say that many arguments from evil rely on a no-seem inference. They rely on the inference from, I can't think of any good reasons God would have for permitting this, to probably there aren't any good reasons. But somebody could say, well, what if there's no inference at all going on in the argument from evil? Or I guess it wouldn't be an argument from evil. What if there's no inference at all going on in the conclusion that a perfectly loving God wouldn't permit that sort of thing? What if I just see something or hear about something horrific? Maybe I just start studying the facts about the Holocaust, and I'm just overwhelmed by how terrible that is. The idea is this. What if I just think, there is no way a perfect being would permit that? I'm not arguing. I'm not drawing an inference. I can just see, plain as day, there's no way a perfect being would permit that. So here what I'm doing is I'm avoiding relying on a no-seem inference. Instead, I can just see plain as day that that is not going to be permitted by a perfect being. And so here the idea is, even if you're right about no-seem inferences being problematic, here's a way to avoid relying on a no-seem inference. You can just see directly. After all, we can't know everything by argument, right? You've got to have premises to your arguments, and maybe eventually you're going to come back to things you know without arguments. Well, maybe this is one of the things that you can know without an argument. Okay, I'll stop there and open up for questions, I guess.
Yep, thank you. We'll take We have lots of time for questions. Please speak loudly, clearly, address your questions to our speaker.
At least for Christians, does the crucifixion of Jesus kind of justify God?
Can you say a bit more about how you think that would work?
Like Jesus bears the suffering on the cross, and that kind of justifies that God there is some reason for God to allow suffering and evil on earth.
Are you thinking about the evil in particular of Christ's suffering, or are you thinking about other evils? Like, suppose I said, suppose I read in the newspaper some story about a child who's been abducted, raped, and killed. And I think, why would God let that happen? And then would you think that mentioning Jesus dying on the cross would be a reason somehow for letting that thing happen?
I don't think it's a direct reason, but for the whole human being, like human race, what you said is a specific,
yeah,
but that is caused by the entire human.
Oh, I see. No, I guess I don't see. Well, let me mention two things that I think are in the neighborhood of that, and maybe one of these is similar to what you were thinking. So one thing is this. It might look to us like this thing is so terrible there couldn't be a reason for it. Maybe whatever, all kinds of cases like that could come to mind. But then if you're Christians, what you think is this. Well, what's one of the worst things that could happen? I'll tell you. God becomes a man to show his love, and they crucify him. That's like the worst, you might think. And then you find out, but wait a minute, that's the best. What could be better than that? That's how we all got to be saved. So here's a case where the disciples, they were despairing, right? It seemed like the worst possible thing. I mean, they didn't probably even fully understand that Jesus was God at that point. I mean, there were certain things that Peter had said and stuff, but they might have been sort of in the dark even then. But if they fully realized what had happened, they would have been thinking, this is the worst thing possible. There couldn't be a good reason for this. Then it turns out there is a good reason for it. Now we have an example. We have an example where something that seems like it's the worst possible thing could have a really, really good reason for it happening. And we can use that as sort of a model to say, hey, look, here's another case of something really terrible. We can't think of a good reason, but as we know, sometimes things that look really terrible, there can be really good reasons for letting them happen. So that may be one way of sort of connecting with what you said. Another example would be this. You might say, what's the best way things could be? And suppose you're just considering the difference between a world where God became one of his creatures, he didn't become his creature, but he became of the kind of one of his creatures, and showed that kind of love. You might think there's no better example of love than God becoming human and dying for us, so that we can be rescued, even those who did that to him. That's the best kind of love there could be. And in fact, if we didn't have that, suppose there was no sin, and suppose there was no sin at all, well, then you couldn't have Christ dying for us because there'd be no need for it. And so you might think a better world is a world where people need to be saved from sin, because in that sort of world you get the greatest manifestation of love possible. Now there are questionable things to say. I mean, I have some worries about that sort of argument, but that's an argument that people have made. That a world with Christ's death it's better than a world without it, Christ's death and resurrection, because it contains the greatest possible manifestation of love, a kind of manifestation we couldn't have if there was no sin. And so maybe that fits better with the kind of thing that you were thinking. I don't know. Does either of those sort of fit with what you were thinking?
Yeah. So I'm wondering, is there any atheists provide very strong arguments against
that sort of proposal? I mean, suppose I thought it was a beautiful thing for one person to forgive another person of even if that person committed a horrific crime against. Suppose I thought, if this person really terribly hurts this person, and then that person forgives that person and they're reconciled, that is beautiful. That's pretty plausible. It's a very beautiful thing. But suppose I arrange for that in my children. Suppose I arrange for one of my children to mutilate, cut the arms and legs off of one of my other children. Why? Well, that way, the other child could forgive this one. What would you think of me? That's a pretty bad thing, you'd think, for me to do. Kind of sounds like that's what we're saying God did. If God arranged for sin so that Christ could forgive us, it might seem like, that's a bit shady. So that's kind of a response to that kind of argument.
Other question?
Yeah.
In response to the person who says that's something that God just wouldn't allow.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be easy to just say that that's based on a lack of knowledge of what a loving God is, therefore it cannot be assumed?
So you're kind of questioning this person's ability to know what a perfect loving being would do? Is that kind of what you're doing?
Yeah.
Can you say that? Yeah. Yeah, I think I have a sort of more extensive sort of thing to say, but yeah, that's kind of what it would boil down to for me. I mean, what I would say is, there are two, when you're trying to think about whether to do something or not, when we're trying to think about it, there are two kinds of cases. Kinds where it's absolutely prohibited no matter what, and other kinds of things where it depends on the consequences. So, here are two examples. You might think rape is prohibited no matter what, and you might think lying is prohibited no matter what. Now, not everybody thinks that. The Christian tradition thought it, throughout medieval philosophy, that's a pretty common view about lying. But, people nowadays don't think that lying's always wrong. Like, what do you do when the Nazis knock on your door and say, are there any Jews here? Do you tell them the truth? Yep. Oh, shoot. Sorry you came to hide with me. No. People think it's okay to lie. But suppose you think it's not okay to lie. It's always wrong. Okay? Well, that's one kind of case. Another kind of case is where you're weighing consequences, like should I give to this charity or that charity? Well, you want to know what the charities do, So you think about the consequences of giving to this charity and the consequences of giving to that charity. You make a decision based on consequences. And so then the question is, think of all the horrible things that we know of. Are any of those things, and also, think about doing something is different than permitting it. So I think I'm pretty strongly inclined to think a perfect being like God would never lie. And actually the Bible says that. But, it seems plausible. To me it does. It seems plausible that a perfect being would never lie. Would a perfect being permit somebody else to lie? Yeah. That seems pretty plausible. Okay, so permitting something is different from doing it. So even if maybe you can think of things that are wrong to do no matter what. But it's very different to think of things that are wrong to permit no matter what. I can't think of any examples personally. I shouldn't say that. I can maybe think of some. But think about all the actual horrible things that we know of. Are any of those things wrong to permit no matter what? Like, what if that was the only way? Maybe you think it isn't the only way. But what if it was the only way to make it possible to enjoy God and know Him forever? Would God say, I'd like it for you to know, to know God and enjoy Him forever, but it's intrinsically wrong, no matter what, for me to permit this kind of suffering. So I'm going to have to permit it, even though I'm going to have to prevent it. Although if I permitted it, this good thing would happen. But no, I think the sensible thing to think is all the horrible things we know of are such that it's not wrong to permit them no matter what. First point. Second point. There's nothing that we know of that's horrible, which is such that there couldn't be anything worse. right? Take any horrible thing that you know of. It's easy to imagine something worse. Just imagine it happening to everybody all the time. Okay, that'd be worse. So, when you think about the horrible things we know of, none of them is such that it's the worst thing possible, and none of them is such that you couldn't permit it no matter what. What does that mean? That means that if there was a reason God had, if there was some good thing that God could only get by permitting that bad thing, then God would do it. And so what the person who's saying is, there's, a perfect God would never permit that no matter what. What they're really saying is this. I know for a fact there's no good reason for God to permit that. And so now there could be, but I know that for a fact that there isn't. That's what they're saying. And now we're coming back to this sort of thing that you were saying. How would they know that? Right? They know they can't say it's because it's the worst thing possible. They can't say that it's wrong no matter what. So they happen to know that among the reasons that there might be, none of them is good enough to permit that. But how can you just know that by thinking about it? It seems like we don't have the ability just to know that. So that's the kind of move that I would make in response to that. But it's basically the kind of move that I think you were making. Yeah.
For someone to kind of argue that if something bad happens, like, someone is allowed to, someone gets cancer and God allowed that to happen, would someone have to say that, like, the ends justify the means in order to say that, God can bring good out of this bad situation, and therefore that makes that bad situation somehow good in the end?
People make this distinction between intrinsic goodness and instrumental goodness. Cancer treatment is not intrinsically good, right? But it's instrumentally good. It's a means to something better. So, in general, that's what people are saying, that there are certain means are justified by certain ends. That doesn't mean that every means justifies every end. It just means that sometimes consequences matter, right? Sometimes, so should we say to this mother, hey, look, the ends don't justify the means, so that was terrible of you to let your child have cancer treatment. We wouldn't say that. Why? Well, because sometimes the ends do justify the means. That is, the end of having her child saved from cancer does justify her permitting the child to have cancer treatment. So that general claim that the ends don't justify the means that people sometimes say, I think what they mean is that many times that's not the case. Why? Well, because it's intrinsically wrong to do the thing in question. Right? Some things are like that, but not everything's like that. So that's what I would say about that. Yeah.
The position that the response from most presuppositional apologists when they deal with this called the problem of theosophy is that the atheist has assumed that there is evil. When one of their biggest proponents, Richard Dawkins, say, under the militant atheistic point of view, says and is quoted as saying and writing that it's just pitiless indifference. As happens.
You mean that the world unfolds without design?
As happens. So I'm Christian, I'm going to swear. So that
as happens. I see it.
You know what I'm saying?
Actually, okay. Stuff happens. Yeah, that's right.
So this is their position. So we have examples of, say, one of the biggest arguments from the atheist point of view is the invasion into the destruction of the Canaanites and wiping them all out. Where they argue, on one hand, that it's bad, but they also show a sort of double-speak or cognitive dissonance in terms of the Canaanites are sacrificing children to their gods. So if God does not permit his judgment to come upon them, then these babies will continue to get slaughtered out. So it's either, in the point of view of the skeptic, is either God is damned if he does and damned if he doesn't. Just your comment on that. The presuppositional apologetic response of evil even existing.
Well, there's a couple of things to say. In response to the Canaanite destruction, the case that comes to mind most from my memory the most clearly is where there's that story in the Bible. This is not really with the Canaanites, although it kind of, I think, harkens back to it the time, but where Samuel speaks to Saul and says, you should have killed all of the Amalekites, and you didn't kill all of them. Okay, and there seem to be stories, I think, even in Joshua and Judges of those kind. all of them have to be killed. That includes the children, that includes the mentally handicapped, who weren't responsible. And the question is this, well, isn't there some way short of that? So the idea is this, presumably the children of the Canaanites, presumably the mentally handicapped among the Canaanites, and maybe even some of the adults among the Canaanites were resisting. Who knows? But if there were anybody who were resisting the child sacrifice practices, why did they have to be killed? So that's one of the kinds of responses that a person, I think, could at least start by consistently making. But maybe your point is more like this. I mean, if you think there is no God, why do you think there's wrong and evil? Is that the idea?
Well, in other words, you're already presuming that there is evil, when one of your proponents is already saying it's just pitiless indifference.
Well, I think what Dawkins, I'm not sure what all Dawkins' views are, but somebody might think this. There's not a governor of the world. Okay? So, but that's a different thing than saying that there's no right and wrong.
There's no objective right and wrong.
Well, no, that's not totally true. So somebody might think this. There are some atheists. I know atheists who think this, and I know some theists who can see the sense in it. Look, even if, I'll put it this way, you don't very often hear this argument for theism. What grounds the mathematical truths? Why is 2 + 2 = 4? You need God, right? That's a very rarely used argument. I never heard anybody use it, in fact. But okay, so people don't argue from the fact that there are necessary mathematical truths to the conclusion that there must be a God. Actually, maybe they did in the history of philosophy. Augustine. Okay, so some people do that, but it's not very popular today. But you can make, you might say this: the argument for morality to God's existence is exactly that way. A lot of atheists think that there are moral truths. There's things that are objectively morally wrong, and that's just true of necessity. Cruelty is wrong as a matter of necessity. We discovered it somehow or other. That's kind of hard to explain. But, we discovered it. We discovered mathematical truths. We've discovered moral truths. These are truths that hold of necessity. They're not because God made stuff up. They hold of necessity. And so there are many atheists who think that you don't have to ground moral truths, just like you don't have to ground mathematical truths in God. You also don't have to ground moral truths in God. And that's, at the very least, it seems to be a consistent kind of atheism. Personally, I think, that makes it sound like I think there's nothing at all to the moral argument for God's existence. I wouldn't go so far as to say that. I just don't really see it as being very persuasive, but, that could just be my fault. Who am I to say how this argument should go?
Let's move on. Another question.
Yeah.
So you seem to be, this appeals to like an epistemological limitation on what we can know.
Yeah.
It seems to just like level the playing field between atheism and theism. So we
It just takes out one way of arguing for atheism.
Yeah. Do you think there's any approach that actually puts the burden of proof on the atheist side, where Christianity is not just as plausible but more probable?
Do I think there's any sort of good argument for theism?
In the problem of evil.
I'm not so sure, but here's the kind of argument that I'm not sure is So Peter van Nieuwenhuizen, you might have heard of him before. He's a Christian philosopher. He says, this isn't really an argument, but what he says is this. Some people look at the evil of the world and they think there can't be a God. He says, I'm the kind of person, I look at the evil in the world, I think there must be a God. Okay? This is following in the tradition of Kant, who thought, it's an absurd world where we really ought to do certain things, and when we do them, our life is ruined. Like, I ought to stand up for what is right, even though it means that me and my family get killed. That's crazy for that to be the way the world is. Here's a less crazy way for the world to be. When we do what we ought to do, justice comes in the end. Now, what kind of argument is that? Well, it's an argument for the conclusion that the world's probably not absurd. Right? It would be absurd if justice wasn't. It would be absurd if we ought to do things that ruin us, and as sometimes seems to happen. It would be not absurd if doing what we ought to do, although it appears initially to ruin us, ultimately vindicates us. So that's one way of thinking about how evil or suffering could push you towards theism. I don't think of that as, hugely persuasive in an argument form, or at least I don't know how to present it that way, but I think there's something to that line of thought. Yeah.
I was just wondering, like, you were saying that if it was the case where the only way God could prevent some great suffering to happen was if he, like, I guess, undercutted the chance that that individual would kind of live forever and, like, enjoy him forever. Couldn't the atheist argue that because God is omnipotent, he can set up the situation such that it's never just a critical choice between one of these two things?
Yeah. So here it gets kind of tricky. So there's this view that God could know what each of us would freely do if we were put into a certain situation. Right? People call that middle knowledge. God, he knows what you would do if you were freely offered a bribe to do something wrong to your friend. He knows what you'd do if he offered you $10. He knows what you'd do if he offered you $1 million. Okay? And it's something that you would freely do. Now, some people think that's impossible. Not even God could do it. You can't know what some would freely do, because if you know what they would if you know what they would do, the whole way that you know it would show that it's not free. Okay, so a lot of people think that. Christians and non-Christians, theists and non-theists think that's impossible. There couldn't be knowledge like that. Others think, no, there could be knowledge like that. Now, notice that if there could be knowledge like that, that might help the atheist out. Right? Because the atheist could say, look, maybe if God would know what we were going to freely do in a certain situation, well, why doesn't he just put us in situations where we would freely choose him? So this is a famous discussion that happened in the 70s. And Alvin Plantinga has a famous reply to it. And his famous reply is this. God's looking at all the people that he could create. Okay, so you and I can't think about... We can think about types of people, but we can't think about uncreated individuals, because that would we have to know too much. We can't do it. But God's perfect, so God can know about uncreated individuals. Each of those individuals has what you might... these are called counterfactuals of freedom. A counterfactual is what would you do if you were in a certain situation? What would you freely do if you were in that situation? And so you might think this. All the possible people that there are, God knows the full, like not just you, but those that aren't created. God knows the full counterfactual of freedom profile. What's a counterfactual of freedom profile? It's a huge list. And on the list is, this person, if this person were in that situation, this person would freely do that. Okay, God knows the full list for every possible person. Well, why doesn't God just make the people, look through the lists, find the people who are going to do the right thing, create those people, put them in the right place, everything works out fine. Why didn't God do that? So you can see how the atheist could use this line of reasoning. And what Plantinga says is this. Well, yeah, suppose that God did have that power. Suppose that kind of knowledge is possible when God had it. If it's possible, then God would have it. He's perfect. But suppose God looks through all the counterfactual freedom profiles for all possible people. And here's what he finds. None of them are such that they would freely choose him. None of them are such that they would be without sin. So God did the best that he could do with what he had. Now, that raises a further question. The further question is, well, what makes them that way? Why do they have that counterfactual freedom profile? What's that?
Who's dealing him the cards?
Yeah, who's dealing him the cards? Exactly. Who's dealing God the cards? And, it's hard to know what the answer to that question is. But that's how that dialectic goes, and it ends up with that sort of worrisome thing. There are things to say about the question, who's dealing God that deck of cards? Why do people have the counterfactual, or even possible people have the counterfactual freedom profiles they do? It's not up to God, so who's it up to? Is it up to them? Well, they don't even exist, so it can't be up to them. So that's kind of a hard question. If you're interested in that question, I can point you to a philosopher, Tom Flint, Molinist, who defends this sort of view. Maybe Bill Craig does too. I'm not sure. But yes.
Do you have any differentiation between horrific natural events and human-caused horrific events? In other words, horrific storms that kill hundreds or thousands of people.
Yeah.
Okay. How in your mind do you differentiate that from behavior of Adolf Hitler?
Yeah.
Annihilates 10 million Jews.
Yeah.
In my mind, there's got to be some differentiation.
Yeah, I mean, here's one way to think about the difference. You might think you can use so it's called the free will defense, where you say God wanted people to be free, that's why he let bad things happen. So that's called the free will defense. That's not going to work with storms, you might think, right? I mean, who doesn't want to be free? Now, there's a couple of ways to reply to that. You could say, well, maybe storms are all caused by demons. Okay? So then demons are the ones who are let to be free. That's kind of a wild guess. Doesn't seem totally plausible. Here's another proposal. If people weren't sinful, they'd be in close communion with God. If they were in close communion with God, they would avoid all these storms because they know when they were coming and they would go to wherever they need to go. You might say that somehow or other sin causes diseases as well. So that's a way to have it all come back to free will. But you could also, you might say, well, wait a minute, what about the pre-human suffering that we, in the evolutionary history of things? There's all kinds of suffering, nature is red and tooth and claw. There you might say, then you couldn't bring human sin into explanation for that. You'd have to point to some angel sin. Or you could just say, God loved an orderly universe more than he loved tinkering with it all the time, making it less orderly. And a part of the cost of that is storms, which result in suffering. But then God's preferring order over avoiding human suffering, and you might think that's not a very good choice. Or you could say, well, the skeptical theist says, I don't know what reasons God had for letting those terrible things happen. But they do seem different in a certain respect if you can't trace them back to moral behavior of personal agents like humans or angels or demons. Yeah.
I've got kind of a pastoral question about skeptical theism and like the position that it puts us in when we're at church, say, and we're praying to God to watch over us and rescue us from sin and suffering and so forth, and we're thanking him for doing so. But then we're also thinking, if we're skeptical theists, I don't really understand why God didn't just prevent all of this, and in fact I can't see any reason that he wouldn't have prevented all of this. Now I know I'm not in a very good position to spot reasons like this, being, frail and finite, but it seems like it puts us in a bit of an odd pastoral position where we're, praying to God for all of these things and we're being grateful to God for all of these things, but at the same time, totally, in the dark about why God would have allowed all of these things in the first place. Yeah, suppose it's a disaster. Suppose a building collapses. Yeah. And now we're praying for those who are collapsed under the building. Yeah. And I'm thinking, oh, wait a minute, God let that building collapse. Well, why do I think he's going to want to save those people who are underneath there? Yeah. I guess I think the skeptical theist should think, well, we really don't know, but here's one thing we do know, that God wants us to ask him for good things, for things that seem to us to be good, and then to trust him to respond as he wants. Yeah. So I think about prayer. Why do we pray at all? I mean, that's kind of like, why do I do anything at all? Why do I brush my teeth? I mean, if God wants me to lose my teeth, I'm going to lose them. So if he wants me to keep them, I'm going to keep them, whether I brush them or not. Well, it's because, or why do I help somebody? The idea is, God, he honors us by giving us power to do things. So that's why I'm honored with, if I help somebody, basically, I can make a difference to the world. That's the honor that God has bestowed upon me. So maybe if I don't help this person, that person will be in need. And if I do help them, the person won't be in need. So my helping can make a difference in the world. God has honored us in that way. And the same thing goes with prayer. God might say no to our prayer requests, but he's given us the honor of contributing by praying. Contributing to the good that can be done in the world by praying. And then I just think, that story in, I think it's actually twice, but it's basically a story of a Hezekiah Isaiah interaction, I think, right, where Hezekiah is told you're going to die. And then, God says through Isaiah to Hezekiah, you're going to die. And then Isaiah leaves, and Isaiah prays. And then God says to Isaiah, go back and tell him he's going to live because he prayed. Okay, so, what I take from that is God wants to ask him for things that we think are good.
it's possible that God granted him that, and that was it was better if he didn't live. I don't know. Maybe sometimes God lets us stumble along with our stupid little ways of, trying to help out. But maybe not. Maybe God thought, I want him to live, but I want him to contribute by praying. I'll see. It's up to him whether he prays or not. He did pray. Good. I'm going to heal him. But sometimes he doesn't. Like Jesus said, take this cup from me. We have this problem of making sense of how God could be limited in knowledge in a certain way. But it seems like Jesus couldn't have said, take this cup from me, unless he was limited in knowledge in a certain way. Because he says, but not my will, but thine, as if I'm not sure what's best. Right? That's kind of a model, too. That's probably a better way of praying than Isaiah prayed. That Hezekiah prayed. Hezekiah was just like, I know what's best. I got to live more. But Jesus wasn't so confident about that. So I guess what I think is, I don't know what the best thing is to happen, but I do know it's good for me to ask God for things that I think are good. Yeah.
Is a skeptical theist skeptical about all the arguments that have ever been put forward for God's existence, and also all possible arguments that could be put forward for God's existence?
I think there are some arguments that a skeptical for God's existence that a skeptical theist should be skeptical of. Because some arguments say, look at how good this is. Whatever, beauty, all the happiness, order, things like that, the current order that we see, that's really a good thing. And so there must be a God who brought about that good thing. But a skeptical theist might think, well, I can't really tell if it's a good thing. It should look good right now, but I don't know what the ultimate consequences of it would be, so maybe it's not such a good thing. So the skeptical theist is definitely limited to some degree or other in the theistic arguments that can be used. But, I think there are atheistic arguments and theistic arguments, while they might be problematic on other grounds, aren't problematic by using bad no-seem inferences. So not every theistic and atheistic argument relies on a no-seem inference. So, for example, you might think, this is an atheistic argument that I think doesn't rely, as far as I can tell, maybe it does in a way I can't tell, but here's an atheistic argument that doesn't seem to rely on a no-seem inference. A perfect being would not let a conscious creature suffer without making it at least possible for some good to come to that creature that's suffering. A lot of animals are conscious creatures who suffer and die, and no good ever comes to them. They don't understand it at all, what's happening, and they don't come alive again. This is going to assume that there's not resurrection of animals. So basically it's like this. Here's an obligation of a perfect being, that a perfect being has to do this no matter what. Never let conscious creatures suffer without making it in some way possible for them to be compensated. And that's the first premise. Second premise, we do see suffering where it's not compensated, namely animals. Therefore there is no God. So that's not like, because it has to do with an absolute duty that God would have, it's not relying on consequences, so it's not relying on a no-seem inference. And maybe the ontological argument for God's existence would be an example of a theistic argument that doesn't rely on thinking about reasons that God would have. It's possible that God exists. It's possible that a perfect being exists, so it's actual that a perfect being exists. But those arguments, I think both of them have problems other than the no-seem problem. But still, those are ways that you can have arguments that don't rely on no-seem inferences.
Can we take one more question?
What would be a concise, good response to give to someone if you're engaged in a conversation and they say, oh, I don't believe in God because there's evil in the world? Is that like going into this entire
Yeah.
what would be like your main response?
A good thing to do when people are making that sort of move is this isn't a concise response, but it's a concise strategy. Try to draw out their reasons for thinking, whatever it is that they say. That's always an annoying game you can play with people, but like 2-year-olds play with their parents very well, But you can sort of just, basically try to draw out why they're thinking that, and then try to articulate their reasons for them. Oh, so you think that a perfect being couldn't have, I mean, what's a good reason for permitting this? There couldn't be a good reason. Why do you think there couldn't be a good reason? So you kind of just sort of ask them questions, trying to uncover their view. And I think, very often what you'll come to is them saying, well, there couldn't be a good reason for that, which is basically, and why do you think there couldn't be a good reason? How do you know there couldn't be a good reason for that? And that's going to eventually lead to them, I think, making an OC inference. They can't think of a good reason for that. So that's not really a quick answer, but it's sort of a strategy questioning that.
Very good. Nice place to end. Thank you very much.